Japanese goods, 20% on Chinese imports, free trade for countries that trade freely with us, like Canada, and within 6 months, 250 miles of double chain-link fence along the Mexican border, and a promise that illegal immigration will stop. Jesse Jackson's words, "Hate and hurt is on a roll in America. If what is happening here were happening in South Africa, we'd call it racist apartheid. If in Germany, we would call it Nazism. In Italy, fascism. Here, we call it conservatism." Those are not all of the disagreements between today's two guests, one active and one potential candidate for president. There are many others, and we will question them about these and other differences. Patrick Buchanan, Republican candidate for president, and the Reverend Mr. Jesse Jackson, president of the National Rainbow Coalition. And our discussion here with George Will, Sam Donaldson, and Bill Crystal, all here on our This Week program. First, a little news. In Japan, in a subway, there is again a poison gas scare this morning. 27 people were overcome and taken to hospitals. In South Korea, 4 executives of the shopping mall that caved in have been arrested on a charge that they knew the building was crumbling but did not tell anyone. A new poll by Time magazine and CNN shows retired General Colin Powell running even or slightly ahead of President Clinton in a race for president next year. The numbers are Powell 44 and Clinton 41. Pollsters say a margin of 3 points is statistically a tie. Powell has not yet said a word about his views on any public issue. Now, Jackie Judd with a report on the bookends of American politics, the left and the right. Jackie?
David, Republican Pat Buchanan on the right and Democrat Jesse Jackson on the left are the bookends of presidential politics.
The thing that Pat Buchanan and Jesse Jackson have in common is an ability to campaign against the core of each of their parties.
Their power lies not in the ability to win an election, that seems out of the question, but in the influence they may hold over those who are viable presidential candidates.
This campaign is not about yesterday, it is about tomorrow.
Buchanan claims the presidential campaign already has been Buchananized, meaning that other candidates have adopted themes he has long championed. For example, frontrunner Bob Dole has picked up on the culture war.
A line has been crossed, not just of taste, but of human dignity and decency.
No doubt Pat Buchanan is seeking out social conservatives. His opposition to abortion is about as absolute as it comes in presidential politics. This year, though, Buchanan has broadened his message.
We're going to bring the jobs home, and we're going to keep America's jobs here.
It is an appeal to economic nationalism, an appeal that Buchanan hopes will extend beyond conservative Republicans to restive Democrats and independents, voters who went for Ross Perot in '92.
They're angry, and Pat Buchanan is saying, well, the people you ought to blame are the parties and the governments who've done free trade agreements and sent jobs overseas. This is a very populist message.
Buchanan is holding his own in the early polls among the pack, trailing Dole. Last month in Kansas, Buchanan promised not to challenge Dole should Dole become the party's nominee. But saying that on the senator's home turf, Pat Buchanan probably was also signaling that he shouldn't be ignored.
No, Newt Gingrich, no.
And ignored is how Democrat Jesse Jackson has long felt he and his constituency have been treated by President Clinton, whom Jackson perceived as moving to the right. It came to a head last month when Mr. Clinton announced a balanced budget plan. Jackson attacked it then as Republican light, and it's gone downhill from there.
Let's end the self-destructive violence and use this moment to put forth public demands, challenge the president, and challenge the Congress to make a priority, put America back to work.
National politics have been drifting away from so much of what Jackson has fought for. Only last week, many black politicians were incensed by the Supreme Court decision striking down redistricting as a means of electing minorities to Congress.
We will not allow the clock to be turned back. We will fight so that justice will reign in this country in spite of the Supreme Court.
Jackson has long advocated affirmative action, in his words, as a way of leveling the playing field. Recently, the Supreme Court struck a blow against that when it ruled, in effect, that the federal government cannot automatically set aside money specifically for minority contractors.
Disregard for racism and historical disadvantage is racist.
Jackson of late has hinted at a possible challenge to Bill Clinton, not as a Democrat, but as an independent. And even though Jackson's agenda isn't front and center these days, such a challenge is still a chilling scenario to the White House.
For every one vote he would take out of the Republican column, you know, he'd probably take maybe 85 out of the Democratic column. I mean, President Clinton's candidacy, it's on thin enough ice. Without something like that, I think I'd sink him for sure.
Whatever Jackson decides, no matter how far Pat Buchanan gets, it's politicians like these on the edges who have the ability to change the equation for those closer to the middle. David?
Jackie Judd, thank you. Coming next, one of our guests and one of our candidates for president, Pat Buchanan. In a moment.
This Week with David Brinkley, brought to you by GE. From power generation to medical systems, we bring good things to life. And by Merrill Lynch. For clients around the world, we make a difference.
I want to tell you about my home far, far away. My mother and father are there, and I miss them.
Communication in all its forms links us one to another. For communications to advance, capital is critical.
Don't forget your homework. Bye.
That's why so many communications companies talk to Merrill Lynch. In the last 3 years, we raised over $50 billion for communications companies around the globe, more than any other financial firm. We connect investors to opportunities and the people of the world to each other. For them, it makes a difference. The difference is Merrill Lynch.
Mr. Buchanan, Pat Buchanan, candidate for president. Thanks for coming. Please.
David, thanks for having me on.
Well, we're pleased to have you. George Will is here with us.
Right.
And Sam Donaldson.
Right.
Now, you say you are the authentic, true, honest conservative in this race. What does that make Senator Dole?
Well, Senator Dole has moved to my position on taxes, David. As you know, he supported every tax increase in the 1980s. Now he opposes them. In 1985, he opposed me on affirmative action when we tried to get it repealed in the White House. Now he's with me on affirmative action. I think Senator Dole in 1995 is echoing a lot of the positions of Pat Buchanan and sounds very much like an authentic conservative.
So who's going to be on the ballot then, if you're both saying the same things?
I think that when I get in a race with Bob Dole, and I think it's going to come down to that after New Hampshire, I can identify myself to the American people in the Republican Party as the authentic conservative who's been right from the beginning, and moreover, David, on the new issues of economic nationalism, of affirmative action, and others we're going to address today, I think I'm much closer to the mainstream of the Republican Party than Jackie Judd indicated, or than Bob Dole is, or Phil Gramm is.
You say economic nationalism. Is that the tariffs you're going to put on Japanese goods coming in, 10%?
Well, what I'm going to do, David, and what I would do, is put a tariff on all countries that practice predatory trade with the United States. The Japanese and Chinese, between them, run a $100 billion trade surplus at our expense. That can't continue. We're exporting our manufacturing base. I would put those 10 and 20% tariffs on, take all the revenue, about $16 billion, and cut taxes on American small business so we create jobs in the United States.
I want to get to something else, but first,
Sure.
you use the phrase predatory trade policies. That usually refers to dumping, which is selling in our country goods cheaper than it costs to make them. Shouldn't we encourage that?
Why would you encourage that, George, when you see your own television industry destroyed by the Japanese because they're dumping products? When you see a fourth of your automobile industry lost?
The answer is we have 200 million television buyers in this country, and they get them cheaper.
George, we are not just consumers. We are Americans. We care about what we produce. We care about American workers, as well as what we can buy at Tyson's Corner, for heaven's sakes. The United States won 2 world wars because we're the greatest producer, manufacturing, industrial power on earth. We are losing that role gradually because other countries are making sacrifices for the future that we are not. Let's take the whole country into consideration, not simply ourselves as consumers of goods.
Let's consider a moment what this country is we're talking about. When you were last on this program, Mr. Buchanan, we had an exchange, and your half of it went like this. I think God made all people good, but if we had to take 1 million immigrants in, say Zulus, next year, or Englishmen, and put them in Virginia, what group would be easier to assimilate and would cause less problems for the people of Virginia? There is nothing wrong with us sitting down and arguing that issue, that we are a European country. Now, I'm willing to stipulate that you're right about the assimilation problem. Right. Some people are easier to assimilate than others in a country like this. But is it your view that American immigration policy should be racial in the sense that it should be designed to keep this a predominantly European white country?
No, my view is that, George, in order to make us one nation and one people again, that we ought to first halt all illegal immigration into the United States cold. Secondly, and I think we could do that with a security fence and strengthened border patrol. Secondly, with regard to legal immigration, we have brought in 20 million people at least, legal and illegal, in the last 20 years. Most of them have come from third world, Asian, Africa, Latin American countries. We need time to assimilate these folks and make them Americans, just as we had time, George, from 1924 to 1965 to assimilate the peoples of Southern and Eastern Europe into the United States and make them Americans. We got to become one nation, one family, and one people again. This is what all the Buchanan policies are designed to do. The tariff policy, to make us more dependent on Americans, buying from Americans again. The immigration policy, to introduce us all to the English language, to American culture, traditions.
But a great many Asian Americans seem to have very little trouble assimilating and a great eagerness to assimilate.
There's no doubt.
Would that mean, in your point of view, that there's no racial component in this? The more the merrier, for example, with Asians?
What I would say, George, is look, every single individual who comes here can be a good American. But there's no question that some groups assimilate more rapidly than others. For example, German Americans and Dutch Americans are fully assimilated. Native Americans, American Indians, are not yet, and they were here first. All I'm saying is, give us time to make us one family again, and all of us can become good Americans who are here right now.
You oppose affirmative action programs, and I want to understand whether it's just government-imposed affirmative action programs, or whether it's all of them, including private ones or voluntary ones that business might put in place.
Well, that's a good question, Sam. I think that state-sponsored discrimination based on race is wrong. Affirmative action is state-sponsored discrimination based on race. It ought to be abolished. It's the first cousin to Jim Crow. It ought to be buried in the graveyard with Jim Crow. But let me give you an example. My high school, for example, Gonzaga, in Washington, D.C., I believe brings in a specific number of young black kids and gets them through, even if they have difficulty meeting the standards and tests. That's a private high school. I think that's a good program. They ought to be allowed to continue that. But with regard to state-sponsored discrimination, I think it should be outlawed as wrong.
So it's all right if business, for instance, IBM, GM, Capital Cities ABC, says we want an affirmative action program, we want to help give a leg up to people. It's okay with you, or would you say that no Capital Cities should not be allowed to do that?
I would say that any agency which relies on federal contracts certainly should have a policy of non-discrimination in hiring. In other words, it should be on merit, ability, character, and excellence. And I think that is legitimate in terms of the, and that's the right thing to do.
But Gonzaga can do it? Now you're confusing me.
It is a private Catholic school, and I think a religious school ought to be left alone.
But they're discriminating.
But listen, it is a Catholic school.
Catholics can discriminate, but the rest of us can't? I mean,
listen,
I'm really confused.
Let me give you an example, Sam. If you went out yourself and used your vast wealth to hire a number of kids to work with Sam Donaldson, you could pick and choose based on race, color, or creed in a private sense, and we would not interfere with it. That's right.
All right, now let me ask you about affirmative action programs as it pertains to Congress. Your Republican friends in the House have signaled in every possible way, short of taking out an ad in the Washington Post, that they do not intend to pass anti-affirmative action bills this year. How do you feel about that?
Well, it's a creeping timidity inside the Republican Party, and I deeply regret it. State-sponsored affirmative action is wrong. If it's wrong, let's do away with it. If not now, when, Sam? If not us, who?
Well,
the American
they say let the
people
Democrats
gave them
take
a
the
mandate.
lead. They say why interfere with the White House's embarrassment on this question?
Well, it's very simple, Sam. I think they are playing politics because they think it will help them with certain constituencies if they go slow and don't take up controversial acts. This is timidity of the kind that has cost the Republicans before and will cost them again if they do it.
I want to go back for a moment to your description of Mr. Dole. You say Mr. Dole has now come around and is a late-blooming Buchananite.
That's right.
And in answer to David's question, you said he now sounds conservative. Now, that sounds to me as though you're skeptical. Do you think he's faking?
I think that Bob Dole is fundamentally, George, an Eisenhower Republican who does move in a conservative direction when the country and party move that way, and I think he's probably sincere in what he said about Hollywood, for example, but I think it's motivated in part clearly by politics in how well we are doing and the importance of gaining the support of social conservatives. So in part it is political. I don't think it's inconsistent with his views, but Bob Dole is not a Reagan conservative. He's an Eisenhower Republican.
You have said that you would support Dole if nominated. Is there anyone currently running who you would not support?
There's no one who can be nominated, I think, that I could not support as President of the United States or as candidate for President of the United States. I think it's going to be me or Bob Dole, George, and I will support Bob Dole if nominated. Let me give you an example. I think if Arlen Specter is nominated, I don't think it's going to happen, I think the Republican Party will split. The Right to Life folks will walk. Many Christian conservatives will walk. At that point, I would not launch a third-party challenge, but I think the Republican Party would be split and very probably defeated.
Mr. Buchanan, may I just ask you for the record to tell us what you think about the trade deal that this administration and Japan concluded this past week?
I think it was pathetic. I think the administration basically walked out in the middle of the street and challenged the Japanese to a showdown, and the Japanese said, well, we're going to improve our behavior, and the administration dropped its threat and walked back into the saloon, as it were. I think even, even Neville Chamberlain got a piece of paper to wave around when he got home. We didn't even get that. What this means, this back down on the part of the administration, is that we face $100 billion trade deficits at the expense of Japan and China into the indefinite future, and we can't stand that if we're going to be the #1 industrial and manufacturing power on earth in the 21st century.
Okay.
It was appalling.
That was a macroeconomic question. I have a microeconomic question now. Orange County, California. The voters have decided not to accept a plan that would help pay for the bonds which they're defaulting on. Don't they have to pay their debt? I mean, it's not a question of taxes, is it? Don't they have to pay their debt?
Well, if they don't pay their debts, they'll be taken into receivership, Sam. But I find it astonishing that many in Washington are very hardline on Orange County, but were immediately rushed to the rescue of Mexico with $50 billion in American loan guarantees in tax dollars for a corrupt, deceitful foreign government, and they take a very hard line toward Orange County. Now, I think Orange County ought to pay its debts and ought to be held accountable, but so should Mexico, for example, and many of these other countries that we routinely bail out with foreign aid and IMF and World Bank loans.
Speaking of Mexico, you do, as David Brinkley suggested, want a 250-mile double chain link fence on the Mexican border. There's about 3,000 miles. What about the rest of the mileage?
That is desert, by and large, Sam, as you know, living down there in at some time of the year. And they're not going to be, the real problem is the folks that come across in the thousands on the weekends or walk across at night in hundreds. They're not going to go across the desert that way. The Border Patrol can handle that.
Philosophically, Mr. Buchanan, what is the difference between the old Berlin Wall and a U.S. wall on our southern border?
Very simple, Sam. The Berlin Wall is a prison wall to keep people in. The security fence is a fence basically to keep folks out from crossing into your area. As the poet Robert Frost said, good fences make good neighbors.
But he meant it just the opposite, Mr. Buchanan.
No, Sam, I think that it is outrageous for anyone to suggest that the United States of America, simply by protecting its southern borders, is behaving like communist East Germany, which shot individual citizens of its own country who tried to leave. Any American can leave this country on any occasion he wants, but we can't have the whole world walking across our borders and still call ourselves a country, and I will put a stop to it.
Mr. Buchanan, may I ask you another political question? You said after New Hampshire, you think it comes down to you and Bob Dole. You mean those other fellows are just going to be out of the race or just effectively out? What is the scenario? Give us the scenario.
I think that, Sam, that Iowa first and the caucuses and New Hampshire primary, they're going to be strewn with political corpses after that. People will not be able to raise the money. We got 9 folks in the race. I think effectively out of New Hampshire you're going to have 2 or 3 running for president. I expect to be one of those. I expect Bob Dole to be one of the other ones. And I think that the race is going to come down to a 2-man race very, very early in this, and I would think that would happen after New Hampshire. If not after New Hampshire, after Arizona and South Carolina.
Mr. Buchanan, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. I enjoyed it.
Pleased to have you. We'll be back in a moment.
He was 50 when it happened. In 3 months, he went from perfect vision to almost total blindness.
You know, you never appreciate the beauty in your life until you can't see it anymore. My wife, my family, my life. Everything I cared about just turned to darkness. And no one could tell me why.
In test after test, doctors were at a loss.
I can't find a thing.
There seemed to be no answers. Finally, a test was done using GE's revolutionary magnetic resonance imager. It lets doctors see things that ordinary tests and x-rays can't. Look at this. Incredible. The doctors discovered a tumor affecting his optic nerves, and he was treated. Within days, he got his vision back.
Hey, what a smile.
And everything that came with it.
Thanks to Sprint Business, the Kelly family is getting bigger every day.
There are over 500,000 of us.
Because SprintNet is the data network that allows Kelly Services instant access to all their people coast to coast. That's how Sprint helps them place more people in more jobs in half the time.
Sprint helped us grow 30%.
We'll help your business do more business. Call Sprint Business.
No matter how you try to squeeze it out or pour it out, you can never get the fat out of sausage. Try all-vegetable breakfast links from Green Giant with 81% less fat than pork sausage, so you get the flavor, not all the fat. Cook up hamburger and you get a whole lot of something you don't even want. Try all-vegetable harvest burgers from Green Giant. They've got far less fat than hamburger, so you get the flavor without all the fat.
Wednesday, prime time takes you inside a house on fire. If this happens to you, could you escape this killer? See how fast it spreads, how quickly your home becomes your worst enemy. What you learn could save your life. Prime time, Wednesday.
We had intended here to bring Mr. Jackson in, Reverend Jesse Jackson in, ask him questions, but there is a satellite problem between here and New Orleans, which we are working on, but at the moment it is not working. So we are keeping Pat Buchanan here in the studio for a minute, if we may, and ask him some more questions while we work on the satellite. You there?
I sure am, David.
Fine, thank you. Now tell me this. You're going to build a wire fence across the southern border. The boats, canoes, rowboats, Lord knows what all, will clog up the Gulf of Mexico trying to get around that fence. How are you going to stop that? You're going to put the Navy down there?
Well, I think the Coast Guard can deal with pretty much the immigration that comes through the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, David. I think they're doing a good job with regard to Haiti and have done with regard to the Caribbean, and I think they can pretty much handle that. But the point is, David, as Ronald Reagan said in 1984, a country that cannot control its borders isn't really a country anymore. And I think we need this time out as Americans so we can all consider what is the proper immigration policy in 1995. And I think that our Coast Guard's perfectly capable there.
This is more philosophy than politics. The American people seem to some degree, impossible to define precisely, seem to be moving to the right, as we saw in the last election and as we see in other evidence. Why? In your view, why? I know you've got a little spiel ready for this. You should have.
No.
You should have.
I was not ready for this one, David.
Well, okay, you can ad-lib.
Right.
You can ad-lib
Right.
this.
I think that what I sense out here is that the American people are deeply alienated and distanced from their national government, which they see as too big, too powerful, too costly, too intrusive, taking too much of their wealth, seizing their property up here in Red Bluff, for example, by putting regulations on. And they used to love, I mean, they love their country, but they have a sense of alienation and distance toward their government. And that is true of the political elites of both parties. Let me give you one example, David. If there's 3 or 4 things the American people want, it's term limits on politicians, no more foreign aid, control illegal immigration, and school prayer. And yet they are told repeatedly, you can't have this. They have a sense they are not even a self-governing people anymore, and they want that back.
Mr. Buchanan, you are credited with giving a certain tang to the Houston Convention in 1992. And I want you to look ahead to the convention in '96 in San Diego on 2 subjects. First of all, what do you think the convention should and will do about the abortion plank in the platform?
I think we ought to maintain the Ronald Reagan abortion plank and keep ourselves a pro-life party because it's the right moral position. It's a banner we ought to stand behind, and because I think it's the best way to unify the party and to keep inside it some of the best people in the country.
Do you think there's going to be some kind of litmus test for vice presidential nominee? I won't ask you yours, but let's suppose the unlikely happens and Dole gets nominated over you. Do you think the convention would insist on what as a vice president?
Well, I think that Bob Dole, if he gets nominated, can probably nominate and get through anyone he wishes. But there's no doubt, George, that on an issue like right to life, there are people who feel profoundly and deeply about that, and their allegiance to that issue is as important as their allegiance to the party, and Bob Dole will have to take that into consideration.
We're about to talk to Jesse Jackson. Now, he's a conviction politician of the sort you are. You got any advice for him? He's listening.
Well, I think that, first, I think Reverend Jackson's, the rhetoric about the Nazis and the rest of it ought to be dropped, but he is dead right in his idea that we got to bring jobs back to the American family and people, to create jobs for inner city folks as well as white working class folks and Hispanics, because the loss in income and real wages of working people is the cause, major cause almost, of the social tinder in America today. And on that, I think he and I agree.
Mr. Buchanan, thank you.
Thank you very much, David.
Thank you for coming. Pleased to have you. We cannot get picture from New Orleans, but we can hear the Reverend Mr. Jackson. You can hear me? Come on in.
Good morning.
How are you? Come on in. Sorry we can't see you. There's something wrong with the satellite. We're still trying to...
Pat Buchanan blew out the tubes.
Okay, fine. Now, come on in and tell us give us your thoughts about what you've heard so far. When will you decide, by the way, whether you're going to run or not?
Well, I suppose later this fall we are studying all of our options now. Our concern is that we expand the party and that Mr. Clinton's message essentially in running be addressed. He talked about an economic stimulus to urban policy, a way of working our way out of a deficit as opposed to this balanced budget arrangement, working our way out of a deficit. Sort of like Chicago, the school system is basically on receivership, public housing on receivership, jails are exploding, people are perishing, and so an economic stimulus to reinvest in America is a significant step in the right direction. I'm all for trading with Mexico and Japan. We have to do it in a way that we lift up their standards and not lower ours. And essentially right now what we're happening is that we see this economic downsizing where American workers are frightened because we're exporting plants and products, jobs rather than products.
Mr. Jackson?
Now we're using affirmative action as a kind of scapegoat.
Reverend Jackson, as you just heard Pat Buchanan say, reaffirmed his position against affirmative action programs. And when the Supreme Court ruled 3 weeks ago on affirmative action, President Clinton's spokesman said that was not inconsistent with Mr. Clinton's own thinking. Is this, of course, one of the reasons why you might oppose him?
I'll tell you what, I saw Mr. Clinton's thinking this week relative to Japan. He said to Japan, you've locked us out, and we will not just be consumers without being a part of business. We want goals, targets, timetables, even playing field, quantifiable, enforceable. I say if we get the same deal, those who've been locked out with the American corporate and government community, as we expect from Japan, he made the affirmative action speech just this past week. Maybe we need make a chance to negotiate a domestic economic justice agreement.
Now, Reverend Jackson, Al Fromm of the DLC suggests that Mr. Clinton must run against his own party's base. And I take it part of the base, a group of African Americans. Do you think that's the winning strategy?
Well, I do not see how it can be a winning strategy for if you, in a sense, abandon labor in this legitimate quest for labor law reform, this concern about uneven working conditions. If you abandon cities, if you abandon that base of workers, then what is there to run on? The DLC is an interesting kind of think tank of Democrats and Republican lobbyists who have the arrogance of ideas without a people base. There are not enough of them to win. Every major DLC candidate this year ran and lost in '94, from Oklahoma to Tennessee.
Mr. Jackson, it is said that if you run and if you do pretty well, you will defeat Mr. Clinton and elect a Republican. What's your response to that?
Well, I didn't run in '94, and Republicans won the House and the Senate. I will not accept that burden. My quest for urban policy, for our cities, my quest for an economic stimulus, and to choose to build more schools and less jails is right in the moral center. It does not make sense, it seems to me, to have the #1 urban growth industry jails and half of all public housing built the last 10 years jails, when we in fact should be having job training centers, putting America back to work and work our way out of a deficit and not do so at the expense of working poor people.
Mr. Jackson, in 1988, you got more votes in the primaries than than Gephardt. You got more votes than now Vice President Al Gore. And you have said this spring that if you think that 1996 is going to be the equivalent of 1876, the equivalent of the Hayes-Tilden election that ended Reconstruction, then you would strongly be in favor of, as you put it to me in a talk, putting another line on the ballot. That is not challenging Mr. Clinton in the primaries, but in the general election. You have a president who is cutting affirmative action, cutting Medicare, wanting to balance the budget, and wielding the death penalty more vigorously. How can you not challenge him?
Well, we certainly look at all of the live options. Let me submit to you that our real concern is that as we move toward 1996, there's now an attempt with this voting rights redistricting decision. Maybe half of black and brown officials will be gone by 1996, which will make it look amazingly like 1896. Interesting enough, in Georgia, I might add, Senator McKinney's district is 60 black, 40 white. They said that's illegitimate. Newt Gingrich's seat is 90 white, 10% black, and that's legitimate. When they shake up these rules, you could very well have Senator McKinney with a 50-50 district and Newt Gingrich with a 75-25 district. That'll be some interesting New South math. I would look forward to a district with 25% black in Newt Gingrich's district.
Mr. Jackson, as you know, some liberals, whites as well as blacks in the Democratic ranks of Congress, say if you run, you will energize the base. It may defeat the president, but it might elect more liberals to Congress and move Congress back to the left or to the center, as you would call it. Does that argument appeal to you?
Well, our interest is bottom up. I would hope that we would have the Congress and the president to see that the central core issue here is put America back to work. Affirmative action's chief value is that it turns tax consumers into taxpayers. It takes those women, blacks, browns who've been locked out, to build a bridge to let them in. Those are legitimate concerns. The labor law reform, a legitimate concern. Why shouldn't Europe and Japan share more of the burden of their own defense at this time? We'll use some of that money to reinvest in America's perishing cities and abandon rural areas.
Mr. Jackson, thank you. I'm very sorry about the satellite. We couldn't see you, but we could hear you. And again, thank you for telling us what you thought.
Thank you very much.
Coming next, our discussion here, and that'll go wherever it goes, we never know. And joining us will be Bill Kristol, editor of a new magazine, The Standard. In a moment.
If you took out everything we make for a loaf of bread, it wouldn't be a loaf of bread. If you took out everything we make for a jar of peanut butter, it wouldn't be a jar of peanut butter. The fact is, a lot of foods and beverages just wouldn't be the same without the ingredients we make at the Archer Daniels Midland Company. Flours, sweeteners, vegetable oils, soy proteins, as well as livestock and poultry feeds, which provide for meat, eggs, and dairy products. At ADM, we produce hundreds of popular food ingredients from America's most abundant crops, and we produce them efficiently, so that food doesn't end up taking too big a bite out of your budget. You won't find the name ADM on your grocer's shelves, but from now on, you'll know we're there. ADM, supermarket to the world.
This Week with David Brinkley will continue in a moment, after this from our ABC station.
Monday, new options in the treatment of impotence.
Also a rural town where most everyone is plugged in, and from Apollo 13, Ed Harris.
Why would I want to kill somebody?
The New Jersey State Commission of Investigation says the geeter with the heater, popular DJ Jerry Blavitt, asked the mob to kill rival DJ High Lit. Did the rivalry between these two personalities almost lead to murder? It's an AM Philadelphia exclusive. Heisky and the Geeter face-to-face on live TV. What'll happen when they meet? You'll find out.
Monday at 10, right after Jenny Jones on Channel 6.
5 years in development, 9 onboard computers, 12 patents. Introducing the elegant and powerful TL series, the new touring luxury sedan from Acura. Engineered to run over the entire car industry and still provide a smooth ride.
Lease the all-new Acura 2.5 TL for $369 a month at your Greater Philadelphia Acura dealer.
Rob Jennings and Phil Andrews, tonight at 6 and 11.
We're back, and this week we have seen the Supreme Court issue a formidable series of 5-4 decisions. 5 justices one way and 4 the other way. And one of the more important, more interesting, was a decision that the redistricting that has been done in mostly southern states, trying to create congressional districts that will certainly elect minorities, was found by the court to be illegal, unconstitutional. So where do we go from here? George, what about this?
Well, in a Georgia case, what they said was race cannot be the predominant, which is to say the overriding consideration subordinating all others. By the way, on the same day, in a one-paragraph ruling, the court refused to hear a challenge to the California redistricting that creates 9 black or Hispanic majority districts. So there's still room out there to create this. But what the court did say essentially was this. We're not going to go into the business of categorical representation, the belief in this country that you can only be adequately represented by people of your own ethnic or racial group, and that's a healthy thing.
Well, the court said the Constitution is colorblind, and in theory, of course, that's correct, and in hope that's correct, but the argument is over what in 1965 the Voting Rights Act was passed for, which said, hey, the Constitution ought to be colorblind, but it hasn't been in practice. People don't fulfill that. We're going to have to do something more. This court has struck down the ability for minorities to be represented in Congress. It's a Georgia case.
But that's just not true.
It's a Georgia case, but if this is extended, and you cannot create a district primarily to try to redress racial imbalance, then you're not
we
going
want Bill Crystal to weigh in
it.
just a moment, but J.C. Watts from Oklahoma's 4th District is 7% black. He's black and he's a congressman. Carol Moseley Brown comes from a state that is predominantly white. She's a senator now. Douglas Wilder was elected governor of Virginia. I think it's about 17% black.
That's 3. Now,
well,
George, do you want to guess how many people will lose their seats if, in fact, the state legislatures redistrict and don't primarily take this into consideration? Put a number on the table.
Most will not lose their seats.
Oh, George.
No, that's correct. Most won't. And most won't, and actually the political power of black Americans will be increased, not decreased by this decision, which is why the Republican Party, incorrectly in my view, in 1990 argued in favor of these kind of racially segregated districts, because it collapses Democratic voters into one district and really marginalizes black voters, and I would argue black congressmen as just representatives of a minority group in America. But the broader point is, I think for 30 years, since the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act, we've had a debate in this country about what they mean. Do they mean that we need to have race-conscious remedies in order to get to equality under the law?
or do they mean colorblindness? And I think with the 94 elections and the 94-95 Supreme Court term, we've rejected what has been now a 25-year experiment in race consciousness, and we're going to move towards true colorblindness.
Back to the good old days. Is that it, Bill?
No, forward to the good new days.
Oh, the forward to good news. If black Americans could, in housing patterns, live where all the rest of us can live or not live, if black Americans, through educational patterns, could be educated as the rest of us can or cannot be educated, then I would agree with you. Then I would agree this decision empowers African Americans rather than detracts from their power. But, Bill, the fact is, still today, discrimination keeps African Americans and other minorities from being able to move so that when the districts are redrawn, they can then participate.
Let's be very clear, Sam, that this opinion from the Supreme Court is a blow to the Republican Party. These districts were created by the cynical connivance of the Justice Department under George Bush, knowing that if they could create these Bantustans to concentrate black voters, they would make all the contiguous districts easier to carry. And indeed, what happened? In 1990, before this happened, Georgia had 10 congressional seats, 9 of them were Democratic. In 94, Georgia had 11 congressional seats, 8 of them were Republicans. It worked, and it shouldn't have worked.
Well, I just want to say to the African Americans watching today, this is a sheep's clothing that you see here. Underneath is the wolf, in my view, who would say, whether it's back to the bad old days or forward to the bad old days, this will diminish your ability to have your representatives in the United States Congress.
This decision will cost the Republican Party seats in Congress.
Well, let's go on to something else. We also had this past week a decision or non-decision about the imports of Japanese cars and the taxes to be, tariffs to be put on them and so on. It looks to a great many as if the Clinton administration went through the motions of facing up to the Japanese and a tremendous deficit and caved in. What do you think, Bill?
Well, I think the new de facto chief of staff of the Clinton White House is his new political consultant, Dick Morris, had told him that Japan bashing was good politics, and Bill Clinton, as always, didn't go all the way. He didn't go as far as Pat Buchanan would have wanted, but he went in for Japan bashing light, ended up cutting a deal at the last minute. I don't think it'll help him much politically. It will be economically trivial. And the real effect, though, is, I think, to strengthen the hands of those in Japan who will advocate a Japan first policy, turning away from America, and that is potentially dangerous.
Well, yes, the White House huffed and puffed and then gave up numerical quotients and all of the rest. On the other hand, we'll know in, let's say, 18 months, certainly by Election Day, whether this is a step forward. My hunch is it's a step forward. The Japanese can go away saying, well, the Japanese can go away as they have in the past.
What?
Well, whether it's that or that, I mean, well, we didn't give in. And Hashimoto can stand there. But he stood there while Mickey Cantor enumerated what the United States expected. Yes, it's voluntary. Yes, there is no... And he didn't say, no, that's wrong. But he only said it for domestic consumption.
These are A, unilateral expectations, and B, the statement that the two countries signed says that no sanctions can be imposed if the expectations are not fulfilled. But there's an unreality about all this in the world of trade. Look, while this was going on this week, the Nissan Corporation announced that it was shifting $30 million worth of business from Japan to a Belleville, Michigan clutch company. Good. They hire Americans, they pay American taxes, they're in America, but it's a subsidiary of a Japanese corporation. Should we be happy, sad, should we care? I mean, why do we care about that?
Well, it's a some win, some lose. But I think that this is a plus because while we didn't get what we said we were going to insist on, we got something. And I think the Japanese, if they move forward, as they have in the past in telecommunications, when they said, well, we didn't agree to anything, but then the telecommunications was opened up somewhat. And in the past on autos, when they said, we didn't agree to anything, but the autos were opened up somewhat. If we're opened up somewhat, it's a plus.
I'm going to interrupt here. We'll be back with more of our ad-lib discussion in a moment.
This is my amazing new GE Profile dishwasher. It's got this computerized brain, which makes it unbelievably smart.
Ah, there you are.
It knows how long to wash your dishes.
Ravioli again.
Because it analyzes how dirty the water is.
Child's play, really.
So it won't waste water, energy, or money while getting your dishes brilliantly clean.
All you need is a brain.
If you're so smart, how come you're doing the dishes?
I hate when she does that. The new GE Profile dishwasher. It's got a mind of its own. What are you looking at?
Every year, the importance of this land increases because every year there are a lot more mouths to feed. Over 95 million more, a figure greater than the population of Mexico. Fortunately, the food ingredients that Archer Daniels Midland makes from America's harvests can help feed people the world over. Food ingredients such as flour, protein, vegetable oils, and corn sweeteners. Making food and feed ingredients to meet our growing nutritional needs. That's why ADM is supermarket to the world.
In Asia, in Europe, the Americas, and throughout the world, the same set of principles guides all our actions. And while we have as clients more countries, companies, and individuals, we don't judge ourselves by this fact alone, but how we live up to our principles. We think that makes a difference. The difference is Merrill Lynch.
You may have made a difference in someone's life. We can't tell you their name or anything about them. We can tell you that by using or being a designated driver like 80 million other Americans, you've made a very real contribution. You see, drunk driving fatalities declined by 32% in the last 10 years. We salute America's designated drivers, and we urge everyone to join you. By doing what's right, you're making things better. A message from Budweiser.
Monday, the marshal's tracking a fugitive.
It's some kind of serial killer, isn't it?
And McBride could be his next target. Jeff Fahey's the marshal. Then, it was supposed to be happily ever after. Instead, it was till death do us part. Susan Day. Bed of Lies, after The Marshal Monday, here on ABC.
Hey, where's the war? Hundreds of millions spent on military hardware, and the Pentagon never asked for it. What's going on with your money on World News Tonight?
This is crazy, but it could be dangerous, so of course we have to take it seriously. Some person, otherwise unidentified, called the Unabomber. I think the FBI put that label on him. I assume it's a man, I don't know, who threatens to bomb an airplane unless the New York Times or the Washington Post or what's the other?
Yeah, well, Penthouse Magazine perhaps,
magazine.
But I think the Unabomber
prints
said
a
no.
long discourse giving his views on the world and everything beyond it. It's about, what, 3,500 words that I read?
Well, it's 65
and, 7
pages.
full pages on the newspaper. And the periodicals in question are deciding what to do about it. What should they do? George, what should they do?
They should print it.
Print it?
Yes, first of all, because the argument against is that there'll be a rash of copycats. Now, the question is how many people are really apt to risk a capital offense, which this is, that is threatening to kill people or killing people, in order to get their screed published in the newspaper. In fact, we've had some experience with this. In 1976, some Croatian nationalists seized a plane, were associated indeed with a bomb that went off and killed someone at LaGuardia, and said, we're going to kill hostages unless you print portions of our manifesto. He said this to the LA Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Chicago Tribune. They all did. We have not had a glut of copycats since then.
Well, you know, George, I'm shocked at you. I mean, all these years when you have argued against dealing with terrorists by negotiating. I mean, in the Mideast, for instance, you've approved of the Israeli
newspapers
stance.
are not governments.
Oh, but lives are lives.
Exactly my point.
But First of all, George, that the Croatians turned themselves in after their demands were printed in the newspaper. And it seems to be reasonable for the New York Times to say, if the Unabomber turns himself in, surrenders to authorities, then they could print his screed. But surely they shouldn't just print his thing and he's still out there possibly going to murder more people.
What makes you think the Unabomber is an honorable person whose word can be taken, who, when he says, well, if you print it, I will never bomb again? This is a cold-blooded killer.
The FBI behavioralists suggest, on the basis of their profile, that he can be taken at his word on both counts. That is, that he'll stop if they do this and that he will kill if they don't.
An honorable man, this murderer.
Well, he may not be, but is it the right of the Post of the New York Times to perhaps condemn someone to death to find out?
No, it is the right of the Post and New York Times to decide what to publish. It is their newspaper. And if they decide that to publish this man's manifesto means that you believe no one else will come forward, no other nut will come forward and say, I'll bomb a plane if you don't publish 150 pages?
I'm saying we have some experience on this, and there was not a rash of copycat
Well, if there is, and you are wrong, should they publish the second one and the third one?
Let's cross that bridge when we come to it. The fact is, if you're walking down the street and a lunatic comes out with a gun and says, give me your money, you're going to give him your money.
Well, I won't
in this
say
case,
I'm saving my money for my old age, no.
In this case, you are saying the Times or the Washington Post should refuse to do this, not to save their own life, but to put someone else's lives in jeopardy, because this man is good at what he does, and that's killing people.
But the lives remain in jeopardy unless he surrenders. It seems
We understand
that is where your analogy breaks down, I think, George. And the Croatians surrendered to the authorities after their demands were printed.
I got the tires shot out in Paris. That's a little different.
If you offered that deal, I doubt he would take it. We'll print it if you will come and turn yourself in.
Well,
if he wanted to do that, he could buy it, but he could print it, have it printed in the job shop.
Would only take Bob Guccione's offer up. He publishes Penthouse magazine. He says, I'll print everything. And the Unabomber, in some little more moral than thou statement, said something to the effect that Penthouse is seen as a girly magazine. Maybe it's beneath this murderous thug to be in Penthouse.
He also says that if only Penthouse does it, he will kill another person. Now, you have to, there is a real possibility. This man has been at this for, what, 17 years now and has not been caught. He's very skillful. You have to take into account the real calculus here, which is you are very probably putting someone in mortal danger.
All right, any more on that, I doubt. But the 4th of July is coming up, and the flag will be very much in evidence, and so we have a move in Congress to make it a crime to burn the flag, which is a subject that the courts have dealt with in the past. What should the courts do about this, Sam?
Well, the Congressional Research Service, and statistics are open to discussion, found 3 cases of flag burning in the United States last year, and the year before they found none. Now, are we seriously going to pass a constitutional amendment to protect the United States flag against, in some year, no cases of flag burning, in another year, 3 cases? It's nothing more than cheap domestic politics, appealing to the, oh, we're more patriotic than you are, we're going to protect our country's flag, when in fact, there isn't a problem.
Well, the Supreme Court 5 years ago struck down laws across the nation that enabled citizens acting through their legislatures to protect what is a unique symbol of national authority, the flag. The Supreme Court, in a very expansive reading of the First Amendment, decided, oh no, it's a violation of free speech for citizens to decide the flag should not be burned or desecrated or trampled. I'm not in favor of a constitutional amendment. I think it's an overreaction. But the real story here is this is what happens when you have an overreaching Supreme Court not allowing citizens to do some minimal things that they think is appropriate in terms for what is really unique. It was a 5-4 decision. What I prefer to do is have Congress simply pass legislation inviting the court to revisit that decision. But I do think it's a little bit much for people in Washington, great sophisticates, to think it's look down scornfully on all those American people who childishly think that maybe the flag should be special.
Well, Bill,
and maybe it really does mean something as a unique symbol of national authority. What a debater you are.
No one looks down scornfully on the American flag. I think sophisticates in Washington probably have served their country in the armed forces and elsewhere, some exceptions, of course. And to say that because you think there's no need for an amendment, which probably violates amendments already in place, like the First Amendment, to say that somehow that's a sophisticated, un-American view is wrong.
No, I didn't say that. I just think one has to respect the kind of popular sentiment out there that thinks there's something wrong when you can't protect one symbol of national authority from desecration.
Bill, I don't think the Supreme Court opinion was particularly expansive when it said that. Long ago, the Supreme Court said the First Amendment protects not just speech, but expressive acts. Now, clearly, if you burn a flag to make a political point, and I can hardly see a reason to burn it otherwise, you don't do it as a sort of act of frivolity or for kindling, then clearly under the idea that we protect expressive acts as well as speech, maybe we shouldn't, but we've been doing that for 60 years, 80 years now, that was a foregone conclusion. The real danger is that this is now the use of a constitutional amendment as a gesture. And everyone's going to have a gesture. They're going to say, well, the environment's particularly important, so we'll stick some meaningless rhetoric in there as to affirm the environment. And pretty soon, the Constitution is going to be longer than War and Peace.
Well, you know, I used to get letters when I covered the White House saying, well, if you don't like Ronald Reagan, at least respect the office. Well, I respect both of them. But the point is, should we pass a constitutional amendment saying you cannot complain about the President of the United States because that is a disrespect for the office, a great symbol of our republic?
Well, it is all of that. One more thing before we go and make it quick because the time is short. They want to raise the speed limit on the highways. George, you in favor of it or against it?
I'm certainly in favor of it.
You
in favor of it.
Sam?
They've done it, and I'm against it. It will cost lives. Far more than the Unabomber will take.
Really?
Classic federal law passed to address the energy crisis. The energy crisis no longer exists. But liberals can never let go of a regulation, and they won't let go of this one.
Question for Brother Donaldson: should we ban cheeseburgers?
But I don't say
They
the
cost
conservatives
lives.
are for killing people.
Are you for
Why when you say liberals are for regulation, when I say every study shows, Bill, and you can't argue at this, the higher the speed, the more lives lost.
State legislators care as much about the lives of the citizens in those states as the federal Congress.
Should we set it at 35?
We can't settle it here today. You have another chance.
Back
another
to the
time.
horse
But
and
in the
buggy.
meantime, thanks everybody.
I read
we'll be
your
back with
column.
a few words about an all-night session of the House of Representatives and what happened while the members are lying around taking naps. In a moment.
This week with David Brinkley, brought to you by ADM, Supermarket to the World, and by GE. From plastics to financial services, we bring good things to life.
This GE compact fluorescent bulb gives you soft, warm light.
Take the ball, Jamie.
It's an energy-efficient bulb that lasts year after year.
Hit the ball, Jamie.
Up to 9,000 hours longer than an ordinary bulb.
Outside with the ball, Jamie.
So it won't need to be changed for about 7 years.
Hey, Jamie, how many grown-ups does it take to change a light bulb? Change a light bulb? Why would anybody need to change a light bulb?
The revolutionary GE compact fluorescent bulb.
The forecast called for a calm, quiet meeting, but a tempest rages instead. It's often the case in today's international business climate, which is why the employee owners of United have prepared a place high above it all, with worldly comforts that refresh, restore, and renew. United Airlines, the calm before and after the storm. We don't just work here. Come fly our friendly skies.
The Dust Bowl, nature's devastating reply to man's neglect of the land. Some say it could never happen again, but the truth is, what you're seeing isn't something that took place 50 years ago. It's going on right now. Each year, some of the most important food-producing land in this country loses an average of 10 tons of topsoil per acre. And with it goes the chance for future generations to expect what we've come to take for granted. Abundant, low-cost supplies of food. Considering the millions of jobs tied to American agriculture and the worldwide dependence on it for food, soil erosion is a problem that must be solved. And it can be, if we all recognize its seriousness and decide to do something about it. At the Archer Daniels Midland Company, soil conservation is one of our primary concerns. We ask that you make it one of yours, too, before it's too late.
Judith Light in the performance of a lifetime.
I do believe the devil made me do it, boy.
She was both a mother and a monster.
This kid is full of arsenic.
Based on actual events.
She murdered your own daddy, girl.
Wife, Mother, Murderer, Sunday on ABC.
Finally, a few odds and ends. Last week I said Senator Jesse Helms of North Carolina wanted a law saying if the State Department didn't answer his committee's letters, those responsible will go to jail for 2 years. He writes to me and said there was a staff memo saying this, but he had nothing to do with it. So, okay, Jesse, just relax. Otherwise, in Washington, the House had a fight this past week about a member's committee assignment and stayed in session all night. The members asleep in their chairs or asleep on couches when they could get onto one. This ran on until 10 o'clock the following morning. While Representative McIntosh of Indiana waited for a chance to speak, he left his speech in his office where his dog ate it. The dog is all right. For all of us at ABC News, until next week, thank you.
Today it's championship boxing, followed by baseball's All-Star Selection Special on ABC Sports.
Meryl Streep.
I don't believe in marriage.
And Jack Nicholson.
Neither do I.
They became Mr. and Mrs.
To love her, honor her, cherish her.
And before they knew it...
Wait a minute.
They'd become Mommy and Daddy.
A word?
They're two-time Oscar winners falling in and out of love.
I know about you and Thelma Rice.
In the comedy that takes a biting look at modern marriage, Heartburn.
Be sure to watch tonight at 11:35.
Back when I was a high school teacher and coach, we had traditional health coverage, but the 90s have changed everything. So we're here at the Norristown schools to see how the teachers and employees feel about going all blue with personal choice.
Freedom. That's what personal choice means to me. I'm not locked into one doctor, and I don't need anyone's permission to see a specialist.
It's flexible like traditional coverage and affordable like an HMO. It's like having your cake and eating it too.
Being a nurse, I know about quality doctors and hospitals, and that's what we get with personal choice.
I have a toddler at home, so I appreciate the plan's $5 office visits.
Wellness programs from Personal Choice help keep my family in shape.
I'd be lost without my easy-to-use prescription plan.
Personally, I can do without the cleaning forms.